after their diagnosis.
And thanks very much to Paula there. Now, the Chancellor will deliver his final budget of the Parliament this Wednesday. And one thing you're almost certain to hear are the words long-term economic plan. But what else is he likely to announce, and what calculations will he be making? Well, the last Conservative Chancellor to put together a pre-election budget was, of course, Kenneth Clarke back in 1997. And he joins me now from Nottingham. A very good morning to you, Mr. Clarke. Well, we've just heard the Chancellor saying this morning that there will be no giveaways and no gimmicks. But he has got to signal some light at the end of the tunnel after the last 5 years, doesn't he?
Oh, he does in terms of economic policy, but yes, you always get this demand for pre-election giveaways, which apparently are going to win you votes and so on. No sensible Chancellor has ever done that in modern times, and the public are not quite as silly as some sections of the press appear to believe. I mean, the public would be very cynical if there was some obvious vote-winning attempt to buy them. What they've got to do, as you quite rightly said a minute ago, is build on this slogan that Downing Street insists on using, a long-term economic plan, actually explain that George, I think, can claim to be one of the most successful chancellors of modern times, who's turned around a catastrophe into about the best growth and employment levels of any other Western democracy, and that not only have we got that behind him, but only a Conservative government could actually go on to the real aim, which is to restore us to a solvent, modern economy that's more competitive, can give us a lasting chance of jobs and growth and so on. And that's the message. What will determine people's votes is whether or not they have confidence that really the Conservatives have done sensible things that had to be done, that they do know what they're doing, that they have been succeeding and they will succeed. And in my biased opinion, none of the other parties have got an economic policy that justifies, setting it out in joined-up writing. It's just got a series of little statements from all the other parties. That's the ones that try to have an economic policy. The right-wing and left-wing protest parties don't even pretend to have any views on the economy at all.
But what does he do about this specific number that emerged from the autumn statement last year, this aspiration in terms of public spending to get it down to 35.2% of GDP, the same levels as they were in the 1930s? And this is a stick with which Labour are beating him, that he wants to take us back 80 years. Can't he ease up a bit on that?
It's a bit of a feather that they're tickling us with, really. I mean, the proportion of GDP is not a very, comparing the 1930s is rather silly because the GDP was so much smaller then. We have been reducing public spending. It's almost down to the level it was in the early days of the Labour government. If he succeeds in that aim, I don't think he'll take it down to the level in real terms when I was Chancellor. He'll be spending more than that. We have had 35, 36% of GDP in the early days of the Blair government, the last Labour government. So all those interpretations of its figure are silly. What you do have to do is realise these are only forecasts. We obviously have got to get down public spending to a level that we can afford. We do need to move into a surplus because the stock of debt's too high. Got to get the debt down. Actually, in practice, you do that in a pace depending on what's happening. This is a dangerous world. I mean, the Chinese are slowing down at the moment. You could have some crash somewhere. Things could change. Our present growth level looks okay. It's getting stronger. We're doing okay. And if we carry on having strong growth, then eventually you run a surplus. But the year when we actually deliver the surplus, it has to be judged by the Chancellor to be the year when we can do that and start to get back to more sensible ways of running the national finances after the wreckage that Gordon Brown, handed on to us.
OK, and what about specific measures? I mean, it's been much flagged up, and of course it was an aspiration, it was a policy of your party in opposition to increase inheritance tax, the threshold, to push that up to £1 million and perhaps beyond.
Well, some of these thresholds you raise every now and again because inflation means that the old cash threshold is a bit low and you can You can get a bit of revenue. Actually, it's quite a good little earner to keep the thresholds where they were, but raising thresholds can be done from time to time. I'm glad we've raised the threshold at which people start paying tax. I did that once, and John Major rather grumbled to me that he didn't think there were any votes in it. Well, actually, there's quite a lot of social justice in it. You take people with very low earnings out of tax altogether, and it does help the ordinary earner, and you actually... We've gone well beyond inflation. We have actually eased the burden on the ordinary pay by raising allowances as we have. You have to do a bit of that, and you should do a bit of that. You don't, no point in being totally hair-shirted in a pre-election budget. I'm not squeamish about my trade, but underlying it all, what you want the public to feel when George sits down is, this guy Osborne knows what he's doing. He's really done all right. That's pretty fair, all that. And, the elderly who can't improve their position after a recession have much prospect ever of doing so without some help. They've got a bit of help. But this is the guy, this is the kind of approach we've got to have if we're not going to fall back into the really chaotic position of some other European countries. I mean, we talk about austerity in Britain, and these have been hard times. Cutting back public spending's always difficult. But we haven't seen austerity like the Greeks, for example, and we had a bigger deficit in relation to our GDP than Greece did when the Conservative government first took over.
Well, what about, you talk about it not being a pre-election budget, but, all these changes, in particular to the pension rules and people being able to access their pots and perhaps sell or cash in their annuities, this is in actual fact robbing one generation to pay for another one and to pay for that elderly generation who are more likely to vote Conservative.
No, it's not. I've been arguing, I think, for the backbenchers when I was last in the backbenchers during the Labour government. For other people argued very strongly to get rid of this compulsory annuity rule. Annuities were frankly a bit of a racket, and in recent years people have got a very bad bargain from them, and I regard all this as very enlightened social reform to enable people to actually handle their own affairs rather better without being forced to buy very bad products in their later years and in their retirement. I mean, he may well continue that because it's a very valuable reform. I don't think we'll go back to where we were, although some of the pension companies are no doubt frightfully upset because annuities were a good little earner as far as they were concerned when people had to buy them at the age of 75, and now people being given more control over their affairs. That's a continuing policy, I think. Now, I'm sorry to be dampening about the pre-election thing, but if you look back, there are chancellors, I won't name them, all of them, but who started just increasing public spending suddenly on some public service. When you get to polling day a few weeks later, nobody remembers all that. I modelled myself on Roy Jenkins, who had been a very successful chancellor, produced a very statesmanlike budget in 1970. The left blamed Jenkins for Wilson losing the election, but actually he'd been such a damn good chancellor that he very nearly beat Heath and very nearly cost the election. And when I gave my pre-election budget in 1997, I didn't have giveaways. We were miles ahead in the polls on economic policy as we are now. And our problem then was my party had destroyed its efforts of being re-elected by an internal row over a thing called the Maastricht Treaty, and Gordon Brown and Tony Blair very wisely didn't challenge economic policy and said they'd just carry on as it had been before and take my figures. Now, I'd cite those two examples. In both cases, key elections, change of power, in both cases, the budget was only relevant in actually just asserting the government's claim, we are the people who are best fitted to run the economy. I think that's obvious now. Most people would accept that about the Conservatives. We've got to persuade people that it is the principal subject at this particular election.
Well, of course, you mentioned there the rows over Europe and Maastricht back in the 90s, and Europe might be a big feature in the post-election landscape. And what do you make of this from Nigel Farage and UKIP today, making very clear his price for supporting a minority Conservative administration, if that's the way the cards fall, that he would want a referendum, an in-out referendum on membership of the European Union by the end of the year.
I would be fiercely opposed to anybody doing any deal with a hard, right-line, right-wing nationalist party that wants to blame foreigners and Brussels for all our problems. It would be an extraordinary thing to do, to enter into an agreement with a party that is just angry protest. And I understand angry protest, but it's not a party that any of the serious governing parties should enter into deals with. If we have a referendum, I'd quite like it to be done early. We've achieved most of the things that David Cameron set out in his Bloomberg speech when he announced his desire to have a referendum. And I think having this, neurotic debate with occasional interventions from Mr. Farage for the first 2 years of the next Parliament is a nonsense that no government, whoever's elected, would really seriously want to put up with. We do have more important things to get on with, on the economy, on reforming the public services, on actually getting the benefits of economic growth to spread more widely amongst the general public, doing something about the hopes and aspirations of young people who've been worse hit by this recession, although everybody's been hit. They're the serious things. I wouldn't do a deal of any kind with UKIP, frankly, and I'd be rather shocked if any of the serious political leaders contemplated doing a deal with him and his party at all.
Mr. Clarke, thank you very much indeed. Very good to talk to you. Kenneth Clarke there, the former Chancellor. And you're watching Monaghan here on Sky News.